Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast, The Joyful Frugalista, and now here's your host, Serina Bird.
This podcast is brought to you by The Joyful Fashionista, an online marketplace for buying and selling second-hand and sustainable clothing. Make cash selling as you declutter or buy sustainable and fabulous fashion. Yuma Frugalistas, and welcome! Today I have a special guest, and of course all of my guests are special. Today we are going to talk about food security, something that is relevant to all of us, including those of us who are really struggling to pay for food at the moment. But first, I have a favour to ask of you. If you enjoy this podcast and find it useful for you, please pay it forward by sharing with a friend. And even better, please follow the Joyful Frugalista podcast. My guest today is Professor le Coutre, who is a chemical engineer who is appointed Professor Food and Health at the University of New South Wales, UNSW. His research is based on cellular agriculture, that's a bit of a mouthful, with the aim of strengthening food security and alleviating the agricultural burden on the environment. Professor le Coutre, and I've been told to call him Johannas, hopefully I've got that right, holds a PhD in biophysics and has an extensive and impressive CV that includes working in the US, Switzerland, England and Tokyo. Prior to joining UNSW, in addition to his research activities, he served as the Secretary General for Nestlé's Scientific Advisory Board and as coordinator of the International Nutrition Symposium, an annual event featuring world-leading scientists debating critical topics in food and nutrition. So I think it's fair to say that my guest today is a world-leading expert on food security. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Serina, for having me. It's a great pleasure, and thank you for the nice introduction. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion now. So thank you.
Well, so am I, and I really want to know why you're so passionate about food security. It looks like you have dedicated your life to this topic. So how did you get involved?
So maybe just with regard to your introduction, by training, I'm actually not really a chemical engineer. I am a professor in the School of Chemical Engineering here at UNSW, which is great. But my background is that I started as a biologist, and over the years, I first was working on photosynthesis during my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Nutrition Physiology. I went then to UCLA, to Los Angeles, where I looked into sugar uptake into cells, which is already some sort of cellular nutrition, if you want. And then, as you had indicated, for 20 years, I've been working at Nestlé in Switzerland. And now here at UNSW, we are looking at cellular agriculture. Cellular agriculture is the whole idea of, growing cell-based cultivated meat is definitely one big part of it.
And that's a big thing right now. That's huge.
Oh, it's huge, for many reasons, and there are many angles to get into cellular agriculture. And again, cultured meat is definitely one of the key topics here. But the overarching idea is definitely to drive a new form of domestication where we would not grow animals, but where we would grow tissues only from animals, and in particular those tissues that are being used. And you can actually do the same with plants as well. We never eat a whole tree, but we do eat apples that grow on a tree. So that's a little bit the idea of what we're doing here. And I can certainly illustrate how that will fit into the overarching food security topic. Again, food security is more than cellular agriculture. I'm teaching a lot. I'm responsible for the UNSW food program, and we see that our kids, the students, high school students and first-year students at university are very intrigued and very interested, not only in saving the planet from climate change, but in particular in food security, in food-related matters, in identifying the role food science can play to improve our world, to improve our planet. So that's basically my background, and that's what we're doing here with the team at UNSW, I should say, very clearly.
Wow, it seems like you've been at the forefront from some amazing things. And just makes me realize how much things have changed in a sense. Like when I was growing up and going through university, when we thought about food security, it was famines, like particularly some of those awful famines that happened in Africa during the 80s and other areas. I would never have thought that in my lifetime I would have seen food security in the country that I lived. But yet it seems that food security is an issue that's now facing everyone.
Well, food security is positive. I mean, overall, the idea of food security is to have a metric that talks about food availability. We can come to a definition of food security. Food security is a positive word, and we like to have food security. A more negative term, at the other end of the spectrum, would be food insecurity. Insecurity is clearly where hunger, where famines, where all of these problems will come in, and we can talk about that. Before we really get started here, we talk about the definition. Clearly, food security is about making sure everybody has enough food to eat, and that there's a number of definitions from, let's say, FAO, for example, put together at the World Food Summit, something saying that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So the key words here are really access to safe, nutritious food and enough. You might want to add into this whole definition also affordable, but affordable sort of conceptually is covered by having the access. So if you have the access, you sort of will be able to afford it. But again, it's about access to safe and nutritious food, and that's what provides food security. And if we had that, and of course for all and at all times, if we can make that happen for everybody on this planet, I can tell you the world will be a better place, very clearly.
That sounds like you just have this amazing vision to want to make that happen. Do you think it's possible? Well, obviously you do because you're working in this space, but what are some of the sort of obstacles or issues alleviating food insecurity?
Well, food always has been essential to life for every creature on this planet, right? Very clearly, we all need food, and the procurement of food is the eating and procreation are the two biological fundamentals to keep species and any species going. So you need to eat, and food security in a complex industrialized world is not just a given. And we have societies, we have economies, we have industries involved in providing food for people in cities like Shanghai, Sydney, Tokyo, big cities where we need to make sure, or also rural areas where we have the poorest of the poor in famine-stricken landscapes try to get food. So food security is not obvious. Maybe we can say at this point still, it's actually an interesting comparison. I'm thinking while I talk, or so maybe we can right now still say that breathing is something that is given. We have some sort of air security. Maybe one day that also will change. Who knows? But food security is something that needs to be maintained actively, and so it is at risk. And with the various different crises that we are seeing in our world, again, there are people who will come to suffer food insecurity. And then you go from food insecurity via malnutrition into undernutrition, into hunger, into acute hunger. So there is a continued spectrum of things going from good to bad. And that's what we're interested in. I can tell you that over the past, up until the turn of the century, over the past 200 to 300 years, it had been very simple, the equation. The idea was to just add more calories would add more years to life. And adding even more calories would add even more years to life. And then by about the turn of the century, in the 1990s or so, it became very, very clear that adding even more calories would be detrimental and would do the opposite, would not be adding more years to life, but instead would take away years from life and would push people, markets, societies, communities into diabetes, overweight, obesity, all the way into cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and these things. So what we need to do is we not only need to provide food, but we also need to provide good food. And that is clearly something the industry picked up upon, but also individual consumers need to see that we need to provide good food for consumers. And that is and remains a challenge. And we are seeing a world overweight or a weight management crisis together with a malnourishment crisis. So these things go together, and the challenges are big depending on the geography you're in.
I so relate to that. We've just come back from a trip to the US. Now, my husband and I are definitely not thin by any means, but I have never felt so thin in my life. But also it was a real challenge for us to eat when we were there. And I know you've lived in the US. It's really difficult. So many foods have so many additives and you don't know how to get around that. In the end, I think we ended up shopping at Aldi because they had imported products from Europe. But that's not really affordable for everyone.
I agree. So I think just on a side note, Aldi, that's interesting. Aldi in the US is Trader Joe's, no? Or do they by now have also Aldi?
They also do have Aldi as well.
The important thing to my eyes, I do hear a slight little accusing of the food that's out there, which is okay. And there are foods that maybe should not be recommended to consumers. But the important thing is also to give back responsibility and throw back responsibility onto the consumers, because we might find large portion sizes of extremely good and nutritious food. And if we eat all of this, even though it is good food and even though it is maybe even without additives, and we do have issues with additives, I'm not putting this away, but we need to work on weight management on both ends of the consumer understanding. So the consumers need to work, and the food producers as well, to work on that weight management problem before that, even on the food security problem. And we should maybe really stick to food security, because the weight management problem is slightly a different one, even though it's related.
Yeah, there's so many complex aspects to this. And of course, COVID has just shaken things up as well. The way that the global supply chains were disrupted has, I can imagine, had a profound impact.
COVID, and again, there are many theories and many stories out there where I would disagree with regard to COVID, but very likely, as you know, COVID seems to have originated in a food market in Wuhan. That much is, I think, a credible idea. And I think we're very close to really having evidence that's what happened. So here you have food already. What COVID did, it locked up people for 2 years or 2.5 years in their home environment, and had restaurants close, or had restaurants even go out of business. So COVID had a lot of impact, and I would not say on a molecular level, but more or molecular physiological level, but more on a behavioral level. It turned active people into couch potatoes, for example. It did maybe make people not go to the supermarket as often as they would want, but COVID changed behaviors, and that might or might not have had impact also on dietary patterns and eventually also food security. Yes, what we have seen, there were outbreaks of COVID outbreaks in meat processing factory farms, pronounced. Again, this is evidence based, and we can say that the environment in those factory farms, meat processing plants, might be very conducive for COVID outbreaks to take place. And that needs to change. And again, this is not directly related to our topic here of food security, but that is something that needs to change. COVID will keep us thinking and keep us busy for still a while to come. And there are so many data. Many scientists for generations will publish papers on the global COVID pandemic. So I'm happy also to revisit that in a future podcast.
Well, there we go. You've invited yourself back, and I would love to have you back. But moving on to 2022, we are living in changing times. I mean, I'm now able to travel. I've been overseas. But what are some of the other factors that are affecting food security this year? We have a few things in Europe, for instance, that are causing some instability.
Well, clearly, the overarching topic will always be climate change. I just happen also to have a very recent report on that, food and climate change, in front of me. Without going into the details, I believe climate change is more of negative impact than the war in Ukraine. But clearly, the war in Ukraine has a very strong impact as well on food security currently. Keep in mind, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and Ukraine is responsible for a majority of the together with Russia, actually, of the wheat exports into Europe. But what that means is that wheat as a global commodity that is traded globally will go up in price on global markets, and we will feel that here in Australia as well, simply because those prices go up. Now Ukraine is also a producer of sunflower oil, and having war in Ukraine leads to blocked supply chains and to blocked availability of, or to restricted, reduced availability of sunflower oil in global markets, which then in turn means that many big food companies who switched from palm oil to sunflower oil are now switching back to palm oil. Now that's really bad. And we're seeing a similar problem. I will not go into this also with energy supply in European countries, that the war in Ukraine has a profound impact on trying to really enter into the 21st century. We are being thrown back into the 20th, if not even the 19th century through war. Now, again, climate change is the bigger issue. I would say we are seeing droughts, we are seeing floodings. That is very problematic. And yet another one where you can always ask, is it the solution or is it the problem, is, I would say, globalization. We're seeing the overarching consequences of globalization to not being independent any longer as countries in our food supply systems. And if then problems arise, immediately we will have problems with food security. So I would say, if you're asking me what are the causes for global food insecurity issues, it is always poverty, it is war, it is climate change, and to some extent the consequences of globalization.
So many factors, and I hadn't even thought about globalization in that mix. Is there any good news amongst all of this?
Is there any good news amongst all of this? I think globalization, in principle, if it's done well and if there's no wars, can be very useful and can be very good. And keep in mind, we have been globalizing ourselves throughout the 90s. We are working on globalization globalization is taking place, and that's my very personal view, for at least 40 to 50 years. It's nothing that just happened overnight. And what we have seen with regard to food security is that the number of people suffering from hunger actually went down in the early 2000s. I think we were below 800 million. Just to see that now we're coming back to being above 800 million people. So we're talking about I'm not quite sure. I think we're somewhere 820 to 850 million people that go to sleep at night hungry, and that is not good. And we were already much, much better. But again, we were better at a time when globalization already sort of had kicked off, yes. And it's just complex relationships.
It is so sad to think that so many people are struggling with food, especially in such a wealthy country like Australia. But even in Australia, people suffer from food insecurity, right?
Yes. And here is now another interesting factor coming into the game, which is the availability of food, which basically is food security, but which is linked with the purchasing power. We have food on this planet in principle for everybody. We are having a massive food waste problem, and I'm happy to talk about food waste.
Yes, please.
But purchasing power is equally important. You need to be able to buy your food. And if you have good food, you will be able to work, and you will then be able to create purchasing power so that you can purchase food and nourish yourself well. It's a hen and chicken and an egg question, but there has got to be some purchasing power to begin with, like there has to be some food to begin with. But this is important. And if you're asking me about Australia, and I'm new to the country, I came only in 2019, I think we are much better off in many ways here. And Australia is a huge exporter of agricultural goods, much more than we're importing. So this is all good. But of course, we have low income groups in Australia. And of course, we also have poor people in Australia who might indeed struggle to nourish themselves in a meaningful and healthy way. And that is a problem. But again, I think looking at the Australian situation, we are much better off than many other countries on this planet because we are far away. We're having a healthy agriculture. We are having a sort of strong and traditional agriculture on top of that, and we're big exporters. So that's always a good sign. Yes.
Well, I'm glad that there are some positives in terms of Australia's food security situation. And you mentioned food waste. So I want to go back and talk about food waste because I know this is also something that you are very passionate about, as am I. So let's talk about how big a problem is food waste globally and how big a problem is it in Australia?
Number one, I in preparing myself have seen that you had Ronnie Khan on the podcast, and without a doubt, Ronnie Khan is the undisputed superhero in fighting food waste in Australia through OzHarvest. So that is great, and I can only learn from Ronnie. 30% of all food is wasted across the entire value chain in our food systems. So what that means is food is being wasted at the agricultural sector, at the agricultural level, in the factory farming level. If we're looking at livestock, food is being wasted at the processing industrial level. Food is being wasted at the storage and distribution levels. Food is being wasted at consumers at home, and food is being wasted in restaurants, making this really scary number of 30% worldwide. And that is not good. We need to clearly reduce that number. As I said, there are many efforts underway, and we should talk maybe about SDGs as well. And I'm happy to do that. But we need to reduce this number, and I think it's a challenge for each and everybody. It's not just playing the blame game and putting the finger on people and say you are wasting food. We all need to see how we can reduce our food waste, and organizations and institutions need to do that as well. And we need to try, Frugal is already, and Frugalista then I guess is going exactly in that direction, is one sort of behavioral attitude you might want to think of. And we need to implement our SDGs. Now the SDGs clearly have a focus on all of the problems we are talking about and more.
So these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? For those people who might not be familiar with the SDGs.
The SDGs are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They originated from the MDGs, which were sort of still a bit fluffy in their explicit spelling of what needs to be done. The UN SDGs are very clear. Number one is no poverty. Number two is no hunger. And then it goes on with very clear goals which need to be achieved by 2030. So when we're talking about food waste, or let me put that in another way, if you are looking at the UN SDGs, and if we manage to get them all implemented, we will not only eliminate hunger, we will eliminate food waste, and we will provide for sustained food security. And you see already that all of these things are really intertwined and interconnected.
They are, and I guess too, all interconnected back with things like climate change too, and gender equality, and a whole range of different things. They all link together, don't they?
Absolutely. So what you can say, and I have said it already, is it's then also about health. It's about individual, personal health. It's about planetary health, and it's about economic health. So three different levels of health. And if you're thinking of a coffee house table with three legs, it always stands stable and it will never wiggle or shake. But the point is that only if you are well nourished, you can drive a healthy economy, which then eventually will give you time and liberty to think about also healthy environment and a healthy planet. You can then in turn nourish yourself again in a healthy way. If any of this interaction is broken, you are putting yourself onto a downward spiral because you are not food secure any longer, and then you will not take care of the planet, and you will not take care of a healthy economy.
All interrelated. Now, I have one final question for you, which is, I know you've done a lot of research about food waste, food security, and all your research background in terms of all the amazing things that I can't even articulate as we end this podcast. But do you personally have a Frugalista tip to share?
Nothing very original. My Frugalista tip is really not original, and I don't know about your listeners. So, but I started cooking, and that was because of COVID. So I can only advise, and here, especially in Australia. So what happened was I moved here in 2018, and my whole family was supposed to be with me right from the start, and then for a number of reasons related to the studies of our son and the work of my wife, I ended up being here, and also the relocation of all of our goods from Switzerland to Sydney. This initial original plan fell apart very quickly in March 2020 already. So I was here alone, and I could not go to restaurants because they were also closed. So I started cooking. Believe it or not,
I'm sort of laughing here because you're, a food security expert now learning to cook in Australia.
There you go. I started cooking. That is usually taken care of in our family, not by me. And I also could not go to restaurants. So that was a very, I think, frugal, but also shareable innovation in my life, or I always knew to cook pasta, just to put that on a certain level. I always knew to cook pasta. I always knew to put a pizza in the oven. But to make things a little bit more refined turned out to be attainable and doable and actually fun. And I would say also a healthy and frugal experience to do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And look, I hear you. I think being able to cook at home is one of the best ways to save money. One of those habit things as well. It's all about those daily habits. And you can do all the research about food waste, but, when you're actually dealing with it in the home, it really brings, on a daily basis, it must bring it to the fore in a way that you maybe haven't experienced in the laboratory or in your research, perhaps, I'm guessing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you so very much for being my guest. It's just truly an honour. We were talking before, I believe this is the first podcast you have gone on, which is really an honour for me, and I do hope to have you back. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for sharing your insights about food security and food waste.
Thank you, Serina. The pleasure was all mine. Thanks.
You've been listening to The Joyful Frugalista with Serina Bird. And of course, sound has been by Neil Hadley.
We could watch the boats flow by. You could talk, and I would listen. I would understand your mind. Oh, I long to be with you, walking toward the sea, and the times when I'm lonely, you could be the one to comfort me every day. I am thankful that our separate paths have crossed. Every night I lay my head down, I know I'll never feel so lost. What if we cross the river? We could start a brand new life with a house and a family. If you'd only be my wife. So I leave it to you now. You can tell me what you think. We could step to the altar. I could wake up to your face each day, and my promise